Hello, and thank you for joining us today for an MP webinar on return to work. We're going to give everybody a few minutes to log on, and we'll start the program shortly. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for an MP webinar on returning to work, best practices and HR compliance. I'm Amy Weeman, the head of marketing here at MP. And for those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management company offering a suite of products and services, including HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance assistance. We support our clients with cutting-edge technical solutions as well as proactive, reliable service and deep HR and payroll expertise. At MP, we are wired for HR and help clients succeed by aligning their HR strategy with their business goals. Your presenters today are two of MP's top HR specialists, Amanda Bridge and Amanda Leonardi. Amanda Bridge is a SHRM certified HR generalist here at MP. She currently provides HR support to small, medium, and large businesses across a variety of industries, and was previously an HR generalist at a 200+ employee pediatric nonprofit organization. Amanda Leonardi is also SHRM certified HR generalist at MP, and she currently provides HR support to small, medium, and large-sized businesses across a number of different industries, and previously managed HR for a 250 employee nonprofit organization. Amanda received her BA from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh and received her SHRM certification earlier this year. If you would like to submit a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And just to note that the recording of the webinar will be sent out following the presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic off to Amanda.
All right, thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the Amanda Show here today to discuss a topic that many of you are probably strategizing around right now, which is how on earth do we bring employees back to a post-COVID-19 workplace? Before we dive into the content, we first have our little legal disclaimer here. This training is intended for educational and informational purposes only. We are not attorneys, and the information we discuss today should not be construed as legal advice. All right, so today we will be covering the following topics. So first, we'll kick it off with what you as an employer should be considering when thinking through and creating your return to work plan. Then how to properly address employee fears about returning back to the workplace. We'll then go through the latest and greatest guidance surrounding mask wearing as restrictions continue to ease up. How to mitigate your risk when it comes to vaccine policies and compliance. And then if we have some time left over at the end, we will jump into a Q&A and answer your burning questions. So let's go ahead and dive in. So, not sure if you've ever heard of this guy before, but a wise man named Albert Einstein once said, "In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity." And if there is one word to describe the past 15 months of our lives, the word difficult pretty much sums it up. So, we have all faced many obstacles, both personally and professionally. Um, and I don't know about you, but I could not be happier to see the light at the end of the tunnel here. And as we are seeing COVID cases go down and numbers of people getting vaccinated increase, the trends are very much moving in the right direction, and that has also become evident through some of the guidance that we are getting surrounding, relaxing some of the workplace restrictions. So it's a really exciting time and a relief for many employers who are eager to get the band back together and reopen their workplaces. With all of that being said, despite the slew of restrictions being lifted as of late, I really think it's a critical time for employers to take a step back and instead of just reverting back to business as usual, think strategically about how you can best bring your workforce back. And I really believe that. The way you go about this transition can make or break you as a company. But let's stay on the positive side and consider what cool opportunities you have to make a lasting impact on your workforce as you start to bring people back to the workplace. So the first is evolution. Um, Pre-pandemic, there were many employers out there that didn't think they could function without people on site each and every day. And the pandemic forced a lot of employers' hands into remote work. And a silver lining to this all, is a lot of those employers realize, hey, this telecommuting thing kind of works. And now that it's becoming safer to have people returning back to the office, this is a great opportunity for, a workplace cultural change. So you have an opportunity to accelerate that change from more of a pre-pandemic static culture to a more dynamic and flexible culture that allows employees to have more autonomy. The second major impact you can have is the employee experience. And you really can't sacrifice the employee experience if you want long term overall success. And this employee experience really needs to be better now than pre pandemic. I think the past year has really put things into perspective for a lot of people and helped them reassess their priorities. And you as an employer have to be competitive when it comes to the employee experience now more than ever. The manner in which you choose to bring people back is going to hold a ton of weight in the overall employee experience. And trust me, if employees feel like it was a negative experience, it's going to be really easy for them to walk away, especially with how many other jobs are open right now in the marketplace. So please keep the employee experience at the forefront of your mind as we go through this today, and as you navigate these return to work plans. And last but not least, you have a great opportunity to showcase empathy as a company. The workplace should focus on employee well-being and needs now more than ever as well. And people have been through a lot over the past year. People have lost loved ones. People have been juggling their full-time jobs as well as being parents and teachers for their children learning virtually over the past year. You have to come at this transition back to the workplace from a place of empathy and understand that people have been juggling a lot and may need some support as they transition back to on-site work. So also keep that in mind. And, if you knock these three areas out of the park, you're going to make a lasting impact on your employees and establish yourself as an employer of choice. And sometimes I hear people refer to these things as the soft stuff when it comes to HR. However, as my teammate and friend Nick Mirabella always says, the soft stuff is really the hard stuff, and is going to be critical as you start to bring employees back to the workplace. All right, so speaking of the hard stuff, let's take a look at some cold hard data that just came out. Jackson Lewis, who's a reputable nationwide law firm, administered a spring 2021 remote and return to the workplace survey that shares some insights from more than 400 C-suite, senior human resources, and legal executive respondents on what the future holds for their workplaces. And some trends have emerged from the data. So we wanted to take some time to share some of the key takeaways with you so that you can see what some other companies are doing out there. So first, we have a data set for those employees who started working remotely because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And 60% of respondents reported that less than 25% of employees have returned to their pre-pandemic workplace. For those employees that have returned, the employee's role primarily dictated whether the return was voluntary or mandatory, and only 29% of employers intend to take a universal approach to their return to workplace plans, while the remainder will, differentiate based upon role, or have not yet decided on how they are going to approach this moving forward. So the key takeaway there is that maybe not every role in your organization needs to be back in the office at this time. Many employers are looking at the job functions to make the determination on who to bring back on site. Employers anticipate that 40% or more of the employees who did not work remotely before the pandemic will continue to work remotely going forward. And then 58% of respondents will allow for more permanent hybrid work arrangements where employees return to the workplace in some capacity, but may continue to work a certain number of days remotely. So all of these data points, it's a pretty large shift from a pre-pandemic mindset. All right, so if we take a look at this pie chart on the left, you'll see that 30% of respondents said that the employees who have returned to work did so voluntarily, and 36% said that employees' role dictated whether the return was voluntary or mandatory. And then only 17% said that they required everyone to come back into the office. So that's a pretty small number. The pie chart on the right shows that right now, the majority of respondents who have established their return to work plans are developing multiple plans for different employee groups instead of taking that universal approach. If we look at this chart, the overwhelming majority of respondents said that they will continue to allow for a more permanent hybrid model where employees only return to the workplace a few days a week. So 58% of respondents were in support of that. And you can also see that 27% of respondents are currently encouraging employees to voluntarily return to the workplace, which will eventually be followed by a mandatory return by a certain specified date. And then one other data point that I wanted to share with you was that 52% of employers expect to implement their return to work plan between 1 to 3 months from now. And 15% expect to implement it 4 to 6 months from now. And this data is hot off the press and was released yesterday. So it is timely data, just so that you're aware of that as well. All right. So we have been doing a lot of consulting and strategizing with clients surrounding returning to work. And one thing that is for sure is that it certainly has people's heads spinning, just like this graphic. So what should you as an employer consider when formulating your return to work plan? There are a ton of moving parts here, so we wanted to break it down for you a bit so that it's more digestible and can be addressed in pieces. So first, if you haven't done so already, I'd recommend assembling a return to work team. I just read about a company the other day that created what it calls a COVID-12 team, which is a group of a dozen company leaders from different areas of their business. And they said that it's been invaluable as a company navigated difficult decisions in the constantly changing world we've been living in. They don't have one person responsible for everything, and their COVID-12 team has leadership and representation from every team, so it's a really collaborative effort. And the team has met and continues to meet on an ongoing basis to make sure every decision that they make is human, and that there are a variety of perspectives that are being brought to the table. You may want to also consider appointing a point person or two from the team to lead and implement these return to work efforts as well. So, although your reopening team may make the ultimate decisions, you really need to get feedback from employees too. And employers should be, including employees in the process and finding out what their perceptions are. This will be especially important if you plan on, requiring everyone to come back immediately, or if you are putting a vaccination policy in place. I really can't stress enough how important this type of feedback and surveying is. So if create a space where employees feel like their voices are being heard, you're asking them about their thoughts and their feelings surrounding returning to the office. You're allowing them to provide suggestions on what will make them feel safe and comfortable returning to work. This is going to establish buy-in and help with the overall transition. And employees aren't going to be as resistant because they feel like that they've had, stake in the game. One thing that you do want to make sure of is that the survey is anonymous. We have been helping some of our clients with anonymous surveys where we will administer the survey on their behalf, review and compile the data, and then present our clients with the findings. And this has been going really well for the clients we've been helping. And it takes their hands out of it. It ensures that the results are anonymous and provides them with data to help them make informed decisions surrounding their return to work plans. One topic that has been extremely hot recently is asking about vaccination status in those surveys. Amanda Bridge will dive a bit deeper into this particular subject a little bit later in the presentation and cover the do's and don'ts. But for the purposes of this slide, I am a fan of administering anonymous employee surveys so that you can collect data on, the percentage of your workforce who has been vaccinated, to help you better understand your risk as well as make informed choices about what types of workplace safety policies and precautions you may need to put in place as you return. Okay, so to give you some examples of survey questions that you may want to consider asking your employees, what concerns you the most about returning to work? How much notice do you need to return to the office? Do you plan to receive the COVID-19 vaccine? To feel comfortable working in the office, what safety protocols would you like to see in place? And do you have any other comments, questions, suggestions, or concerns regarding COVID-19 and workplace safety? And again, the answers to these questions will give you a solid foundation to begin to build your return to work plan off of. All right. So, as we all know, employers have to ensure their workplaces are safe and as safe as they can be, right? And this is why many of us have been working remotely for the past year. But it is important to keep in mind that employees and customers may have fears of returning to, business as usual. So, preparing for and communicating how safety is a top priority will relieve some fears and increase your brand loyalty ultimately. So some safety measures that you may want to consider might include implementing, employee health screening procedures, developing, an exposure response plan that addresses, isolation or contact tracing procedures, stay at home requirements, having an exposure communication ready to go that can be sent out to impacted staff who may have had an exposure. Also providing PPE, masks, gloves, disinfecting spray for workstations, personal hand sanitizer, making sure that you're detailing cleaning procedures that you're implementing, as well as, make it clear of your expectations for employees to clean their workspaces. You may want to consider establishing physical distance measures within the workplace. So maybe you're moving workstations to increase, separation and distance. And then you want to be sure to establish some customer and visitor protocols to ensure their safety as well as the safety of your workforce. So next, you'll need to plan for how and when employees will return to work to create an organized and controlled approach. And all employees returning, on the same day at the same time could certainly be overwhelming and possibly unsafe. So you may want to consider some alternative approaches. So, maybe phasing in employees returning to work. So, using non-discriminatory factors to phase people in and determine who's going to be phased in, and determine schedule changes to provide protection to workers. So maybe you're going to stagger shifts for the time being to reduce the amount of people in the workplace at once. You also want to create a plan for employees in high risk categories for infection to return to work. So maybe you consider allowing them to work from home until they feel comfortable to return, or determine increased measures to protect them when working on site. So maybe isolated workstations or additional PPE as requested, fewer days in the office, things like that. You also want to determine how to handle employees who are unable or unwilling to return to the workplace. So, maybe someone who's fearful of returning, or someone who has family obligations that may interfere with their ability to return to work. So, you want to have a plan in place for that. And you also want to take a look at potential business travel if that impacts your organization. So you may want to start with essential travel only and define what that looks like, and then over time allow some more flexibility there. All right, now this is really important. You also need to know your local, state, and federal requirements about returning to the workplace. Many state and local governments have imposed their own, mask wearing and social distancing requirements. So you need to take a look into what those are in the places that you operate. So some states like New York, New Jersey, to name a couple, recently started requiring employers to track employees' vaccination status if employers are going to allow vaccinated employees to no longer wear masks or socially distance at work. So keep your eyes peeled for more updated legislation surrounding this in the coming weeks, because it is changing rapidly and more states are, changing their requirements off the heels of the CDC's updated guidance. Your state also may have some industry specific requirements surrounding safety precautions that you need to be aware of. Some states have passed their own legislation requiring employers to provide employees with COVID sick and family leave. While it still remains optional at the federal level, like I said, some states are requiring that employers provide paid leave for COVID related reasons, as folks are beginning to return to the workplace. And then OSHA. Don't forget good old OSHA regulations as well, which we will likely be seeing some updated guidance from them surrounding mask wearing in the near future. So even though restrictions are relaxing a bit at the federal level, you'll still need to stay in the loop about ongoing changes that are happening at the state and local levels as well. Communicate, communicate, communicate. So, establishing a clear communication plan will allow employees and customers to understand how the organization plans to reopen, or reestablish, their business processes. So you really need to communicate this clearly and transparently to your employees. You want to get out ahead of any questions that employees might have, so that it alleviates potential anxieties or fears for those employees. If employees feel like you're being completely transparent, they feel like they know your game plan, they know what you're doing to keep them safe, and they know that you have expectations of the team to take care of one another, and communicating that from a place of empathy and understanding is ultimately going to lead to a positive employee experience. On the other hand, um, if you aren't forthcoming, you may take a colder approach and just send out an email saying all employees are expected back in the office on Monday. That's going to potentially lead to a negative employee experience and will cause employees to put their guards up, and have an overall negative experience throughout this transition process. So be sure that you communicate almost to the point of nauseum so that employees feel like they can trust you. And when you're communicating some topics that you may want to, include in those communications, staying home if someone's sick, physical distancing policies that you're putting into the workplace to protect workers and customers, details on, training on the new workplace safety policies and protocols, have exposure response communications like we talked about ready to go to any affected employees and customers potentially, inform employees of any other policy and procedure changes, and then finally provide employees training on those new protocols and expectations. All right, another thing you may need to consider is new hire paperwork. So, employees returning to work who remained on payroll throughout this pandemic would generally not need to complete new paperwork. However, for those who have separated employment, so maybe you had to lay off some workers and you're recalling them, it may be best to follow, normal hiring procedures when bringing them back. One thing to also keep in mind is to address I-9 issues for folks that you've hired remotely during the pandemic. So, as most of you probably know, the requirements surrounding in-person document authorization for the I-9s has been relaxed, and employers were permitted to verify employees' I-9s and their authorized documents virtually when they were hired during the pandemic. However, once employees return back on site and or the I-9 flexibility is lifted by DHS, employers are still required to verify those documents in person. So if the I-9 was completed remotely, you're going to need to complete the in-person document verification upon the employee's return to the workplace. So just keep that in mind as well as you're bringing people back. All right. So, although the trends are moving in the right direction, like we talked about, and more people are getting vaccinated, there are certainly still anxieties and fears that employees have about returning to the workplace. We've all spent over a year of our lives in, a state of emergency with people we love getting sick, people we love passing away. Many of us have gotten sick ourselves. We haven't been able to spend, as much time with friends and family. Everywhere we go, we're reminded of the severity of COVID for the past year. And so this has understandably created great fear and anxiety for a lot of people out there. And our brains have been wired to be on guard for the past year. And that is a really hard habit to break overnight. Um, it's funny, I'll throw myself under the bus here because I catch myself watching like TV shows and movies with scenes of people in crowds or like concerts. And I find myself stunned at times that like no one's wearing a mask. And then I, come to my senses and knock myself out of it. I'm like, Amanda, this is just a TV show. This isn't real. Or, this documentary was filmed years ago. So I think it's just important for employers to, keep in mind that people's comfort levels may take a bit of time to get back to a place where they feel safe coming to work and being around bigger groups of people, and unbreak the habits that we've established over the past year. Um, and helping employees feel comfortable about returning to work, will require more than just managing the rational fear of catching COVID-19. So it's important to keep that in mind. Fostering a strong sense of psychological safety, um, as much as physical safety will be imperative for employers, as vaccines continue to roll out and the risks of returning to work reduce. Um, so how do you navigate this? You need to be understanding of the fact that people have different comfort levels. The way each of us feel about the situation and about the safety of ourselves and others is different. Just because John may feel comfortable going to the office and not wearing a mask doesn't mean that Mary sitting 6 feet away from him would feel comfortable with that. So we have to be aware and understanding of that. One important and easy step you can take is to normalize that it can be challenging, acknowledge it. Um, Create a safe space for employees to discuss concerns so that they don't feel like, they're being crazy or overreacting, which then might cause them to suffer silently. And when employees bring up these concerns, be sure that you're remaining open-minded and providing flexibility. One tactic that will likely help address return to work fears is to plan for, an incremental transition. The more people are exposed to situations they feel uncomfortable with, the more comfortable they gradually get. So let them dip their toes in the water and get acclimated before pushing them fully in. Provide that flexibility and try to avoid mandates as much as possible. And doing that and giving employees that flexibility in how they manage their own return to work will minimize the potential for feeling, pushed too far too fast. And as we discussed earlier, and I will repeat several times today, transparency and communication is key. Empathetic leaders who regularly check in on the emotional pulse of work groups will be better positioned to craft messages that address employees' fears successfully. Um, and managers who are taking care of employees and their whole sense of well-being will have an easier time with this transition than those who are focused purely on output when it comes to bringing people back. All right, so many of you probably have some burning questions surrounding the relaxed mask requirements. So the CDC has lifted its COVID-19 related masking and physical distancing recommendations for fully vaccinated people in non-healthcare settings. And according to the CDC, fully vaccinated employees can safely return indoors in many situations without wearing masks, without social distancing, or undergoing COVID-19 screening procedures. With all of that being said, keep in mind that the CDC guidance is not legally binding and only tells employers what behavior the CDC thinks is safe based upon their expertise when it comes to contagious infections and diseases. As we discussed earlier, some state and local jurisdictions are imposing their own mask wearing requirements, so you do need to check in on those requirements prior to making any type of decision. Um, for those employers that aren't subject to more stringent local laws or state laws, you will have to choose whether to drop mandates or keep stricter rules in place. So again, what does the CDC say? The CDC states that fully vaccinated people don't have to wear a mask or stay 6 feet apart except where required by local business and workplace guidance. They say that fully vaccinated people can resume activities without wearing a mask, except where it's required by law, including local business and workplace guidance. And according to the CDC, prevention measures, including masks and physical distancing, are still recommended for unvaccinated individuals. So, if there's one message that I want you to remember from this presentation today, it's this: one size does not fit all. You really need to take a look at your workforce, gather the data, and let that help you determine what the best next steps forward are. Just because the restrictions are lifted or just because your friend's company is implementing a certain policy does not mean that the same policy is going to be the best fit for your business. So I encourage you all to do your due diligence and really take the time to understand what types of implications these policies you're putting in place may have on your employees, as well as the level of risk you may be opening yourself up to from a compliance standpoint by implementing them. So, what should you consider when updating your mask policies? Of course, like we've discussed, check the relevant state and local laws. If a state executive order or local order requires you to continue to have employees wear masks or impose physical distancing requirements, you should follow those rules. You also have to keep in mind that some states have their own occupational safety and health rules, or recently enacted laws. For example, New York's HERO Act. So um, just be mindful of that and keep your eyes peeled for that and those updates. In addition to that, some states are considering bills that would limit an employer's ability to treat employees and customers differently based upon their vaccination status. And the governor of Montana actually just recently signed such a law. So, long story short, employers must follow all applicable state and local laws and standards, regardless of the CDC's relaxed recommendations. Also, keep in mind that the mask guidance does not apply to every industry. People, must cover their faces and practice physical distancing when they go to a doctor or long-term care facility, when they're traveling by public trans, things like that. You also want to be on the lookout for new guidance, notably from Osha. They've updated their website advising that they're reviewing the recent CDC guidance and will update their materials accordingly. In the meantime, OSHA is directing employers to refer to the CDC guidance for more information on measures appropriate to protect fully vaccinated workers. However, that tune could potentially change. We also want to determine whether removing mask and physical distancing requirements makes sense given your employee populations and preferences, while remaining in compliance with state and local laws and orders. So many employees may be reluctant to return to the work site without masking and physical distancing rules in place. So it's really important that you assess whether removing such requirements is going to help or hurt the business objectives. Generally, employers can choose to continue to require masks and physical distancing, regardless of vaccination status. So that might be something you want to consider as well. You also want to consider how removing mask and physical distancing requirements will affect customers. So if your ultimate decision is not to relax the mask requirements, you want to be mindful that customers who have medical conditions that make wearing a mask unsafe may need to be accommodated as well. If you do end up lifting mask restrictions, clarify that fully vaccinated employees and customers are still permitted to wear masks or face coverings if they so choose. And also emphasize that all employees are expected to be supportive of their coworkers' choices. You definitely want to reinforce that employees must respect employee and customer decisions to wear masks and engage in distancing regardless of their vaccination status. You also want to avoid actions that would, suggest a potential correlation between vaccination status and mask wearing. So, for example, if relaxing mask and distancing requirements in the workplace, make it clear that fully vaccinated employees should make their own personal decision regarding whether to wear a mask and physically distance at work. If an employee chooses not to wear a mask, then it will be the employee who is disclosing their, vaccinated status. You also want to consider whether and how the business will monitor unvaccinated employees and if they're properly wearing masks and engaging in physical distancing practices. It is lawful for employers to ask employees if they're vaccinated. However, uh, proceed with extreme caution. Asking employees why they are not vaccinated may implicate the Americans with Disabilities Act. If employers ask employees if they are vaccinated, the best practice is to, treat any record of their status as confidential and make sure it's securely maintained with limited access. As an alternative to tracking, who is vaccinated, you may also want to consider having employees certify that if they're not fully vaccinated, they will continue to wear a mask and physical distance. However, again, check your state and local requirements because they may have different, requirements in place when it comes to vaccine tracking and relaxing mask mandates. And then last but not least, you want to consider adopting a formal policy or issuing a communication, clarifying the business policy and position on these issues. All right, so if we're looking at the big picture here, when it comes to masks, some words of advice. Don't rush the decision. Just because these restrictions are rapidly lifting does not mean that you have to also follow suit. So keep that in mind. Also proceed with caution. Properly weigh your risks and determine the best policy for you. Communicate your policies effectively. Make sure your employees know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. The unknown can cause unnecessary fear and anxiety, so it's best to be transparent and clear. And then know your state and local requirements. And lastly, be sure to protect masked workers from mistreatment. So make it clear to people that this will not be tolerated. For those workers who are unable to receive the vaccine for legitimate medical or religious reasons, or for those who, continue wearing masks because they choose not to get vaccinated, you need to make sure that they, don't face mistreatment at the hands of supervisors or coworkers. OSHA continues to state that unvaccinated employees should not be treated differently than vaccinated employees. So make sure your workers know that retaliation, discrimination, and harassment will not be tolerated, and include this in written policies distributed to workers as well. Overall, safest approach for an employer, particularly a business operating in multiple jurisdictions, is to apply the most restrictive and protective guidelines across the board. And as the directives become more clear and more consistent, an employer then can relax protocols more uniformly from there. And with that, I am going to toss it over to the other half of the Amanda Show here, to give you the rundown on COVID vaccines in the workplace.
All right, great. Thank you, Amanda Leonardi. So good afternoon, everyone. So just like Amanda said earlier, one size does not fit all. So in addition to that, I am going to ask that you also remember that just like my parents always told me, just because you can doesn't mean you should. The EEO has weighed in with guidance that answers some workplace vaccination questions. Employers may encourage or even possibly require COVID-19 vaccinations, but policies must comply with the ADA and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which covers religious accommodations, and other workplace laws according to the EEO. So, federal EEO laws don't prevent employers from requiring all employees who are physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19. However, employers need to comply with the ADA's reasonable accommodation provisions, along with Title VII, which covers religious accommodations, and other EEO considerations. Employers will also want to consider some barriers that employees may be faced based on location and availability of the vaccine. So not everyone is going to have that easy access of, acquiring the vaccine. In this instance, making vaccines mandatory could impact employees negatively. Be aware that other laws may place additional restrictions on employers, and that there are a lot of states that have their own specific laws, so it is important to keep that in mind. So like Amanda had said, we're just going to keep monitoring every state and the guidance that they're putting out. So what does OSHA say about vaccines? So employers are not required to record employees' side effects from COVID-19 vaccinations under OSHA. So previously, OSHA had released guidance that said employers who mandated their employees get vaccinated, any adverse effects from the vaccine that the employee endured may have been considered an OSHA reportable incident. However, the DOL and OSHA, along with other federal agencies, they're working diligently to encourage COVID-19 vaccinations. So OSHA does not wish to be viewed as discouraging workers from receiving COVID-19 vaccinations, and also does not wish to deter employers' vaccination efforts. OSHA will not enforce recording requirements to require any employers to record worker side effects from COVID-19 vaccinations through May of 2022. Okay, so this might be the $1 million question, maybe not even $1 million question, but maybe $2 million question. Can we ban employees from coming into the workplace if they refuse to get the COVID-19 vaccine? So short answer is yes. In the EEOC's FAQs, it does state that employees who are not vaccinated may be excluded from the workplace, subject to important limitations. However, I'm going to use that word a lot. This does not mean that employees are excluded can just be terminated. You still may need to provide them with a reasonable accommodation for religious or medical reasons. So you want to evaluate the positions, and especially those that are in healthcare and employees who are tasked with protecting the public, to see if an unvaccinated employee would pose a threat or a direct threat, and that threat cannot be eliminated or reduced by a reasonable accommodation. And so this direct threat standard under the ADA is a high standard and must be also based on objective medical evidence and individualized assessment. Based on these determinations, you should follow pre-established procedures to respond to any accommodation requests. And it is also important to keep in mind that many states have enacted or pending legislation, which we've talked about, which provides additional protections for employees beyond the EEO laws in regards to COVID-19 vaccinations. In certain states, these restrictions could even eliminate an employer's right to require the vaccination. So you want to be sure to review all anti-discrimination laws in the states where you have employees. So what are some of the considerations before requiring employees to be vaccinated, if this is what you or your organization are considering doing? So first, you want to evaluate both the legal and practical issues before making the decision. And I'm not going to speak on the legal standpoint of things because I'm not a lawyer. However, if you want to join us on our webinar on June 17th and would like some legal advice, we will have an attorney from Jackson Lewis who will be presenting. I will say that you do need to ensure that you can effectively communicate how the vaccination requirement is job-related and consistent with business necessity. So when creating a mandatory vaccination policy, there are a couple of best practice guidelines. Ensure that the policy fully explains that vaccine requirement. And it should also communicate how if an employee can or needs to pursue an exemption, they know how they're able to do that as an accommodation. Be prepared to engage in the interactive process for reasonable accommodation. And then some ideas, of what might be a reasonable accommodation. They could be the use of a face mask at all time while on site. You could even consider moving an employee's workstation, temporarily reassigning that employee somewhere. Continuing to approve that teleworking arrangement that you've previously had, or offering a leave of absence. Employers will not need to provide an accommodation that would pose an undue hardship. So I think we've all probably heard that term before, an undue hardship, but the undue hardship standard depends on the request and also state and local laws. So Amanda had shown us some of these return to work survey questions and results. And so we're going to take a look at a couple throughout my part of the presentation. And this survey asks if employers that are requiring employees to be vaccinated or if they plan to. So only 2% said that they would be requiring employees to be vaccinated in the workplace. However, the majority, which are both 50 and 54%, said that they would not be requiring it because of legal risk and concerns with that, as well as employee relation issues. So tracking vaccination status or vaccine status and some concerns about that. So while it is okay to ask for documentation for the vaccination status, you should also let the employees know that they don't need to provide any other medical or family history information. So you just want to make sure that they're not handing you their entire medical file with all of their, shot history all in there all at once. You just only want the information that you're asking for. So if you receive documentation, you will want to treat that as confidential and, have it be that confidential medical record. You want to avoid retaining any copies of actual vaccine cards because that could trigger any kind of safety record keeping obligations that you probably would like to avoid. So a suggestion to do the alternative would be to create a confidential spreadsheet. And on this spreadsheet, it should have the employee's name, what type of shot they received, and the date of that last dose that they got. So you want to also stay away from asking any follow-up questions such as, what are the employee's reasons for not being vaccinated? Because this could really trigger obligations under the ADA or GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So the EEOC and all of these companies all these places are coming out with all of this new guidance. And so this one just actually came out this last weekend, and it really helped provide employers with some options on incentivizing it. If you decide to go with either of these options presented by the EEOC, you will still have to consider accommodations and also confidentiality. This guidance provides a clear direction if your organization wants to encourage workers to get vaccinated. The first option for the EEOC defines places where an employee could have been vaccinated as pharmacies, public health departments, or any other healthcare providers in their community. However, for option 2, if an employee voluntarily receives a vaccination from your company, or if you have a third-party provider, you can only offer incentives that are not so substantial as to be coercive. So you want to be careful of that if you are offering them on company premises. So if you decide to go the incentive route, it doesn't mean that you're free from having to provide any accommodation or confidentiality. And there still will be some employees that could have a legitimate medical or religious reason for not getting vaccinated. And you don't want to deny them of their incentives because that could be discriminatory. So you will need to consider finding a way to offer an alternative way that they can earn the incentive as well. And an alternative way to earn this could be watching, possibly having a COVID-19 safety video, or even reviewing any kind of CDC literature on stopping the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. So I also wanted to share this return to work survey that was published by Jackson Lewis, so you can get an idea of how other companies are planning on handling surveying employees for vaccination status. Also, if they're planning on offering any incentives, which we just covered. So as you can see, 41% of employers plan on surveying their workplace on vaccination status. Remember, if you do a survey for your employees, you want to make sure that it is anonymous to avoid any kind of discrimination claims. Then we have on the other side, 49% of employers do not plan on offering any incentives, whether it be monetary, PTO, or any other kind of benefits. And we are going to be offering the link to this Jackson Lewis return to work survey at the end of our presentation in the resources. So you'll be able to have access to these results there. All right, so can we share vaccination status with clients or customers? So we did talk about confidentiality. And so, I had mentioned that employers were allowed to ask employees what their vaccination status is, but they should not disclose any of this information. And it really should be treated confidentially. Some employers have considering separating out employees based on vaccination status. So, potentially putting all the vaccinated employees and having them do an assignment, and then having all the unvaccinated workers do an assignment. But if you think about this, even this could be considered sharing confidential information, because if you're splitting up the teams into 2 groups, basically you're letting everyone know who is and who isn't vaccinated. So definitely be careful of those kind of out of the box ideas. So if you do decide to conduct an employee survey to see if your employees are going to be vaccinated or if they plan on being vaccinated, I just wanted to let you know some of the considerations. You definitely want to be consistent and you want to ask everyone. So you don't want to just, pick a group and ask them. And you also want to ask everyone the same questions. And so the ADA specifically restricts employers from making a disability-related inquiry or requiring medical examinations. But the EEOC says that COVID-19 vaccinations are not considered medical examinations and that requiring or asking for proof of an offsite vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry. However, related medical inquiries or follow-up questions such as why the employee will not be vaccinated would be a disability-related inquiry. So you want to stay away from those. And if you decide to conduct a survey, it should be designed to only ask questions that allow for yes or no answers, because you don't want to allow a text box or something where an employee might elaborate as to why they're not getting vaccinated. And so this will help avoid any violation of the ADA or other laws, even under GINA. So Amanda had also mentioned that, we want these surveys to be anonymous. That's important. The reason for this would be really if an employee were to be terminated or disciplined, the employee could just really say that the employment action was based on their survey response and their answers. So you want to consider your industry and your workforce before developing an employee survey. It would need to have a legitimate business purpose. meaning if you have a fully vaccinated fully remote workforce, doesn't really seem relevant to conduct a survey. So whenever I'm on webinars, I always find scenarios the most helpful. And so I am going to dive into the first scenario that we have here, which says your organization is hiring and has required vaccination policy. When you are deciding if an employee is the best fit for the position, you are also considering their vaccination status. So what do you do? So you can ask, but remember, all the same considerations apply to applicants as they do your current workforce, your current employees. So you need to be careful of the follow-up questions. Again, you will need to consider the demographic and make sure it doesn't lead to any discrimination. If you decide the applicant is not the best fit for the position and they shared the reason why they are not getting vaccinated was due to a health issue, you could really be setting yourself up for a discrimination claim. So definitely tread lightly there. And then on scenario number 2, we have your organization has decided to require employees to be vaccinated. Joan has said that she doesn't plan on getting the vaccine and is not asking for a disability or religious accommodation. So, Joan just basically put it out there that, she doesn't plan on getting the vaccine. So what do you do in that situation? Well, one of our favorite HR phrases is, it depends. You want to start by asking if they want to share their concerns about the vaccine. And so the EEO says that employers can share information about the vaccine, such as the importance and where to get it. And if Joan isn't comfortable sharing information, then consider that there are things that she might not want to share with her employer. So it may be that she is considering trying to get pregnant or going through IVF treatment. And she's concerned that there's really a lack of information about the vaccine and pregnancy. And so what do you do next? I mean, if she's not sharing the information, you've asked her to share some of her concerns, you need to figure out another way. So even though you may not be required to accommodate them under a specific law, understand that we need to be flexible in this environment and consider other options, such as, the possibility of changing a work location, like we had discussed, wearing a mask, or other situations that could help ease her concerns. So you could present Joan with some of the options and, other things that we had kind of touched upon to see if that would help with her concerns and her worries about getting the vaccine and, returning to work. So we're going to hop over to the next slide, which contains the resources that we promised you we would deliver you today. And we covered these in our presentation, and they're surrounding the CDC guidance. And we wanted to provide you with the full Jackson-Lewis report that contains the return to work data that we discussed. And so here's the copy of the presentation will be sent to you after we wrap up today, and you'll have access to these resources. Pass it over to Amanda to address see if we got any questions in.
All right, thank you. We have some great questions here. The first is, do you have any tips on how to navigate guests and visitors who may not be vaccinated? Can we ask them for test info or vaccinations? Again, it not one approach fits all. It's one, not one size fits all for employers. So it's really going to depend on, you as an organization and the type of work you do and those types of considerations. But I will say I'm more inclined to say potentially continue the mask requirements as opposed to soliciting any type of vaccination information from, customers or clients, things like that. So I'd recommend going more in the direction of continuing some of the safety precautions that have been put in place up until this point in order to, avoid making any missteps there when you're asking for vaccine information from visitors and guests.
Yeah, that's a great point, Amanda. Like you had mentioned, take things slowly, don't just rip the mask off and continue business pre-pandemic. So, keeping masks on and monitoring the situation is definitely an advisable way to go. Okay, so can an employee ask another employee if he or she is vaccinated? So I think this is the only thing people talk about. I run into people that I see, or, I even talk to clients all the time, and it's such a hot topic. And I think it's just so natural that we were like, oh, are you getting vaccinated? It just comes out of everyone's mouth. So employees can ask other employees if they're vaccinated, but I really just want to caution the employee environment and making sure that no one's really discriminated against, or that anyone feels that they're treated misfairly just because of their vaccination status.
Yeah, I agree. And to Amanda's point, it totally does come up naturally in conversation. I mean, it is definitely the hot topic these days of like, ooh, which vaccine did you get? But I would just be really, really careful. And I've had a couple of clients ask me questions along the lines of, well, can our supervisors ask this information from employees so that it's not, we're not asking all employees? Keep in mind your supervisors are an extension of your organization. And so, sending them into more or less, for lack of a better term, do the dirty work is still, you're still, at risk there. And you still want to, proceed with caution when it comes to that. We did have one question, and just quickly, because I know we are at time here, someone had asked to go back to the slide about the percentages of folks one second here, let me go back. So the percentage of folks who are requiring employees to be vaccinated. So here is that graphic. Again, you will be receiving a link to this so that you could really analyze it in more depth afterwards. But you'll see here that 54% of employers or respondents most likely are not requiring the vaccine mandates due to legal risks. And then 50% are most likely not requiring due to employer relations issues. There's a very small subset of the respondents to this survey who are mandating vaccines for their employees. So again, we'll send you the link to this so that you can do a deeper analysis.
Yeah, we did get a couple more questions that we will certainly we'll gather up together and answer those offline for everyone so that they get their questions answered. But just in respect of everyone's time, I'll pass it over to Amy.
Thank you, Amanda Leonardi and Amanda Bridge. Great presentation. We hope you all came away with some helpful information about best practices for returning to the workplace. If you do have any further questions, as Amanda mentioned, you can send them to marketing@mp-hr.com. And have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks again for attending.